Book 2, Chapter 4, Part 6 of History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Cole. History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1 by Henry Charles LEA. Book 2, Chapter 4, Conflicting Jurisdictions, Part 6. One of the articles required the execution of the Concordia of 1520, which embraced that of 1512, the fulfilment of which the Catalans had never ceased to demand, and the manner in which these solemn compacts were argued away is instructive. In 1566, Govilla, Bishop of Elna, who had been Inquisitor of Barcelona, calmly asserted that the Articles of 1512 had been revoked as prejudicial to the free exercise of the Inquisition. The Suprema, in urging Clement VIII to refuse confirmation of the new Concordia of 1599, argued that the transactions of 1512 and 1520 were invalid through simony, as the Cortes had obtained the assent of Ferdinand in 1516 (Sikh) and of Charles in 1520, by conditioning subsidios on it. Leo's bull of condemnation in 1513 was relied upon, and that of confirmation in 1516 was dismissed as obrepetitious and surreptitious. So Cardinal Adrian's action in 1520 was represented as conditional on confirmation by the Holy See, and as in no way binding on the Inquisition. So, in 1632, the Barcelona Tribunal drew up a statement to be laid before Philip IV by the Suprema, adroitly mixing up the affairs of Aragon and Catalonia, and telling him that the Cortes of 1518 demanded the revival of the Articles of 1512, that Charles refused to swear to them, that Juan Prat interpolated others, for which he was imprisoned, and that the effort failed. In transmitting this, the Suprema added that the fact that the Cortes never ceased to demand the enforcement of the Articles showed that they had never been observed. From first to last it was a history of deception, in which kings conspired with inquisitors to betray their subjects, without even the excuse that the faith was concerned in these details of secular jurisdiction. The Catalan temper was not soothed by the disappointment of 1599, and the refusal of redress prompted resort to forcible measures. There was a contest in 1608 in which the Banch Real uttered a sentence of banishment against the inquisitors. A vessel was made ready for their deportment, but, when the day came, they barred their door and hung over it a portiere of black velvet to which was attached a crucifix. The city showed its piety by placing candles in front of the sacred emblem, and the chapter sent priests to pray before it. No one ventured to disturb it. The Diputados, the chapter and the city authorities interposed, and an accommodation was reached. A more savage quarrel arose in 1611, in consequence of the veguer disarming the coachman of an inquisitor. The city authorities seized the temporalities, laid siege to the palace of the Inquisition, sentenced the inquisitors to banishment, and proclaimed it with trumpets through the streets. This they justified to the king by telling him that the Holy Office had been instituted for a limited term which had expired, so that it should be abolished in Catalonia, and the cognizance of matters of faith be restored to the episcopal courts, all of which, we are told, gave his Majesty much concern. Mutual detestation did not diminish, and, when the Cortes of 1626 were approaching, the inquisitors anxiously urged the Suprema to impress upon the king that the peace and preservation of Catalonia depended upon the maintenance of their temporal jurisdiction. The deputies, they said, were holding daily juntas, and accumulating stores of documents from the archives, asserting that the time had expired for which the Inquisition was instituted, and if they accomplish their intention, they will destroy it wholly. That they were really alarmed is visible in their asking the Suprema to secure some compromise. The Suprema duly represented the danger to Philip IV, who in reply gave assurance that no prejudicial change would be approved, for his unceasing desire was to promote the exaltation of the Inquisition. After the Cortes had assembled, the Tribunal reported, June 27th, that they had drawn up a series of articles effectually disabling the jurisdiction of the Inquisition, and that they declared that they will not vote a subsidio until the king shall have confirmed them. The articles deemed so obnoxious scarce amounted to more than the Concordia of Castile, so long in force, save provisions that the inquisitors should be Catalans and should take an oath to obey the laws, and that disputes of jurisdiction should be settled by a junta consisting of an inquisitor, a judge of the Audiencia, and the Bishop of Barcelona. Moderate as they were, Philip kept his promise and referred them, September 23rd, to Diego de Guzman, Archbishop of Seville, acting head of the Suprema in the vacancy of the Inquisitor-Generalship, so that on the adjournment of the Cortes the whole matter remained suspended. An attempt at compromise was made in what was known as the Concordia of Cardinal Zapata, arranged December 24, 1630, between him as Inquisitor-General and the Council of Aragon. This made no substantial change in the jurisdiction of the Inquisition, but was directed chiefly to restraining the misuse of excommunication on the one side, and the recourse to the Banch Real on the other, by providing that all disputed cases should be settled by competencias conducted according to the received form of procedure, under penalty for a first offence of 500 ducats on the tribunal refusing, and suspension from office for a second. This left untouched the roots of trouble, and accomplished little, in consequence, it is said, of the delays and evasions of the inquisitors, and frequent recourse continued to the Banch Real, especially by creditors. The Cortes of 1626 had not been dissolved, and they met again in 1632 to conclude their unfinished business. As usual, the Tribunal and the Suprema prepared for the struggle by earnest appeals to Philip, who responded with assurances of special care in all that concerned the Inquisition. The Suprema had the hardihood to tell him that the Concordia of 1512, on which the Catalans based their claims, had never been confirmed, but it was within the truth when it said that it had never been observed. It declared, moreover, that the articles framed by the Cortes would so prostrate the tribunal that it would have to cease its functions. A memorial by the secretary of the tribunal, Miguel Rodriguez, gives a deplorable account of the social condition of Catalonia, where the barons and gentlemen, the cities and church foundations, he says, possessed excessive powers, and where the bishops were also barons. The hostility of the nobles and cities to the familiars was manifested by the daily murders committed on them and their children, and the burning of their houses. But for the protection of the Inquisition they would be exterminated, for its jurisdiction was the only one respected. Fathers enjoyed the murder of their sons, sons that of their fathers, and wives that of their husbands, for fear of greater evils, and, in addition to this, was the turbulent temper of the population. The viceroys had nominal power, but it was exercised only on the common folk and not on the powerful, whom no one dared to accuse or to bear witness against. All this busy preparation was superfluous. The Cortes was dissolved without gaining their object. The Inquisition as usual had triumphed, but peace was impossible between the incompatible claims of rival jurisdictions. In 1637 the Suprema complained of the continuous series of troubles and of the disregard of the Concordia of Zapata. This time the offender was the Viceroy, the powerful Duke of Cardona, who had imprisoned a familiar for carrying a pistol and refusing to surrender it, and had arrested two servants of the receiver, fining one and discharging the other. When the tribunal sent to him a priest bearing a monitorio with excommunication, he shut the priest up incommunicado in a room of the palace. Then he invited to dinner the fiscal of the tribunal and shut him up likewise. He ordered the inquisitor to withdraw the excommunication, and on his refusal he pronounced sentence of banishment, posted 400 men around the Inquisition, and made ready a vessel to carry him to Majorca. The inquisitor assembled 5 bishops, who declared that Cardona had incurred the excommunication of the bull Sede Protogendis, and the inquisitor so declared him, though for the avoidance of scandal he forbore to publish it. Under the intervention of the bishops, the sentences of banishment and excommunication were mutually withdrawn, and the Viceroy released the priest and fiscal, boasting that he had carried his point. Thereupon the Suprema asked the king to execute on Cardona the penalties of the Concordia of Zapata, and greater ones, in view of his unprecedented acts, and also that the ipso facto censures of the canon Si quis suadente and the bull Site Protogendis be published in order that he might seek the salvation of his soul. To this the weary king could only reply by deprecating these unseemly quarrels, and ordering that viceroys should not try the cases of familiars. Cardona apparently having undertaken to do this only because there was no other authority that ventured to do so, although the offence was one that forfeited the fuero. Soon after this, in 1639, a still more serious trouble broke out in Tortosa, in which the magistrates were involved, and the people rose against the Inquisition, but while this was in progress the Catalan rebellion broke out, and prudence counselled abstention from severe measures of repression. Whatever share the Inquisition may have had in stimulating the disaffection that led to the rebellion, the unredressed grievances which so excited the Cortes nowhere appear on the surface. The proximate cause, as has been stated above, was the burning of the churches of Montero and Rio de Arenas by the Neapolitan troops quartered on the people. Some consecrated hosts were found reduced to coals, and the peasants, who had suffered from the outrages of the unpaid soldiery, rose in arms, cut them off in detail, styled themselves the Exercit Christia, and bore on their banners the venerable sacrament, with the legend Senior Judicao Vostra Causa, and claimed that their object was to protect the people and defend the Catholic faith. In fact, the Inquisition was invited to prosecute the guilty authors of the sacrilege, and undertook to do so, but of course the culprits could not be identified, and it was reduced to excommunicating them in bulk. It was against the representatives of the king that the initial riots of June 7 and 8, 1640 were directed, when the judges of the royal audiencia and the viceroy, the Count of Santa Coloma, were murdered. The inquisitors at once proffered their services to the Diputados, and, at the request of the latter, they wrote to the king and Inquisitor-General, praising the efforts of the Diputados to preserve peace, not knowing that for months they had been organizing the rebellion in correspondence with France. When, too, in September, a tax was laid to put the land in a state of defence, the assent of the tribunal was asked as to levying it on familiars. There was thus no open hostility towards the Inquisition, but at the same time there was no respect for its inviolability. When the mob rose again on Christmas Day to put to death all Castilians, there was a report that 2,000 of them were concealed in the Inquisition. Led by a coachman of one of the inquisitors, the people broke into the Inquisition, maltreated the officials, hanged some of them, emptied the money chests, and found in the secret prison a solitary Castilian on trial for heresy. Him they carried to the town council, who returned him to the tribunal and garroted the coachman. When on January 23, 1641, terms of submission to France were concluded, the Inquisition was provided for. Having cut loose from Spain, it was impossible to permit the tribunal to remain subject to the Suprema in Madrid, and the clause respecting it was that all inquisitors and officials should be Catalans, jurisdiction should be predicted to matters of faith, and it should be directly under the Roman Congregation of the Holy Office. Still the inquisitors remained at their posts. For 5 months they had had no word from the Suprema. They expected to be called upon to take the oath of allegiance to King Louis, and they sent their secretary, Juan de Arezzo, to Madrid for instructions, suggesting that they had better move to Tarragona or Tortosa. Philip ordered them to remain, and they resolutely obeyed, but the situation grew constantly worse, and on November 7th they made another appeal, representing their danger, their destitution, their inability to perform their functions, and their expectation that they would be forced to kiss the hands of the Marshal de Brezé, the approaching French governor. This was confirmed by Don Antonio de Aragon, who had just returned from Barcelona. On 2 occasions the mob had set fire to the Inquisition, and heresy was rampant, for many of the French troops were Calvinists, and Calvinism was openly preached. The Suprema characteristically debated the question under 4 heads. Shall the Inquisition be removed to Tarragona or Tortosa? Shall the Inquisitors kiss the hands of the French governor? Does their lack of means to prosecute relieve them from prosecuting native or French heretics? Shall testimony against such heretics be taken in Madrid and action be based on it? After elaborate discussion, the 4th question was decided in the affirmative, and the other 3 in the negative. Juan de Man Oscar was appointed to gather testimony in Madrid, and the inquisitors were told to stand their ground and do their duty, using censures and interdict if necessary. If driven from the town, they were to carry with them the records so as to be able to work elsewhere. One of the inquisitors, Dr. Cotona, had left Barcelona for his home in Majorca. The other 2, with most of the officials, stood to their post, and, in August 1643, they were called upon to utter fearful curses on unknown parties, supposed to have committed a sacrilegious theft of consecrated hosts. Towards the end of September, however, they were expelled, to give place to a native tribunal, and it was done with a refinement of cruelty. There were 10 in all, 7 subordinates and the son of one of them, besides the 2 inquisitors, who had stood faithful to their duty. They were put on board a vessel, with orders to land them in Portugal, which, like Catalonia, was in revolt against Spain. Although the crew consisted of Catalans and Frenchmen, they were persuaded to put into Cartagena, with a promise of being allowed to sell their cargo there. The reception of the refugees was most inhospitable. The vessel was seized, and the cargo and effects of passengers and crew were embargoed. Much red tape had to be cut, and it was not until December that the conclusion was reached that the crew had rendered an essential service, exposing them to punishment by the rebels, wherefore the vessel was released, and they were allowed to dispose of the cargo. The refugees were without salaries or resources, and it was not without difficulty and delay that the Suprema, professing its own inability to help them, secured from Philip some moderate ayudas de costa to keep them alive. Then, in March 1644, it ordered them to open a tribunal at Tarragona, at the same time representing to the king that this would cost 4,500 ducats in silver for the first year, and 4,000 annually thereafter, which might be supplied from the 2 millions of maravedis coming from the tribunal of Cartagena, apparently some recent large confiscation, as otherwise they would die of starvation. They were doubtless thus provided for, and did what they could to restore the old-time dread of the Holy Office. It had sadly diminished in these evil days, for in the same year, 1644, in the neighbouring town of Tortosa, Inquisitor Roig of Valencia complained that on reaching there during his visitation, the magistrates did not come to receive him, they assigned him no lodgings, and they refused to publish his proclamation. Meanwhile, in accordance with the terms arranged with France, the Catalans had organized a national inquisition. Dr. Paulo Ferran and Dr. Joseph Pla were appointed, and application was made for the usual papal faculties. These were granted, and when the briefs were received, September 26, 1643, they were installed and the Castilians were expelled. The new tribunal had not much to do. It did not meddle with the Calvinists in the French armies, but it vindicated its authority by an auto de fe, celebrated February 23, 1644, in which one victim was garroted and burnt, and there were 2 penitents. There was another, November 7, 1647, in which there was an execution for unnatural crime, and 6 men and 5 women penitents, mostly for bigamy and sorcery. The only other evidence of activity that I have met is an investigation ordered by Pla, at the request of the parish priest of Pineda, resulting in the trial of Antonio Morel. When the troubles of the Fronde compelled Mazarin to withdraw the French armies, the rebellion collapsed, in spite of the obstinate determination of the Catalans to sever relations with Castile. When Barcelona surrendered, October 11, 1652, Catalonia was left at the mercy of the conqueror, but Philip, with true statesmanship, restored it to its ancient privileges and liberties, save a few exceptions which have no bearing on our subject. Inquisitor Pla had lingered at Gerona, continuing his functions in virtue of his papal brief. He was found there by the Marquis of Olias y Mortara, who only ventured to suspend him and wrote to the king, October 12, 1652, for instructions, adding that the prompt re-establishment of the Inquisition would conduce greatly to the pacification of the land. The Council of Aragon, November 16th, approved of this, and the next day Philip instructed the Inquisitor-General to make the appointments and dispatch the inquisitors at once. There were financial difficulties, however. January 18, 1653, the Suprema reported the appointments. The infection of heresy by the French promised much work, but there was not a lack of money. The tribunal would cost 6,000 ducats a year, while its resources were but 2,000, for the separation of Roussillon lost it 1,000, and it had 2,000 more at Barcelona, loans which were uncollectible. There was prospect, however, of large confiscations, for many Catalans had fled to France, who would be prosecuted, and on the strength of this, the king was asked for 4,000 a year. The adjustment of these questions probably required time, for it was not until August 2nd that the new inquisitors took possession of their office, riding in state through the city, with drums and trumpets and the standard of the Holy Office, followed by all the familiars and officials of Barcelona, and making public proclamation in the customary places. The next day, Sunday, the Edict of Faith was read, and on Monday they commenced their functions. Of the Catalan inquisitors, Pla died within a few days, and Ferran was arrested at night, as were many others, some of whom were sent to France, and others were deported to Majorca. Apparently their official acts were not recognized, for familiars of their appointment continued for some years to apply for reinstatement. No sooner was the tribunal re-established than the old troubles recommenced. Abuses must have been flagrant to call forth from Philip, June 2nd, 1661, a cedula ordering the exact observance of the Concordias, and restraining the excessive use of excommunication. The quarrels which arose were prolonged and complicated by every possible device. On February 15th, 1664, Juan Mateo, actual receiver and acting alguazil mayor of the tribunal, was murdered. On most slender suspicion, the next day it arrested Joseph Guimart and Joseph Mazat. The Audiencia claimed the case, and the tribunal refused to enter into a competencia until the Banch Real threatened the inquisitors with banishment. Then they averted the preliminary conference by questions of etiquette, repeatedly disregarding the orders of the Suprema, until the intervention of the Queen Regent enforced obedience. The conference was at last held, and the papers were transmitted to the Suprema and the Council of Aragon to decide as to the jurisdiction. While this was pending, the inquisitors started another trouble. They had confined the prisoners in the secret prison as though guilty of heresy. This was a grievous hardship, and the Queen ordered them transferred to the common prison. The inquisitors reported that this had been done, and then, on pretext of information as to a plot to escape, brought them back to the secret prison. When the Suprema heard of this, it wrote in a tone of mingled anger and fear, lest it should be discovered by the Council of Aragon. The prisoners must be moved back again. The affair had become too important. The Council of Aragon had made too many efforts, and the Queen imputed it all to the Suprema, as they would see by her enclosed order. Then the competencia was suspended by the escape of the prisoners, March 9th, 1666, and the last we hear of the matter is their negotiation for pardon in 1668, on terms of which the Viceroy advised the acceptance in order to avoid decision of the competencia. It was doubtless so settled, for competing jurisdictions had brought the administration of justice into such shape that it was better to let criminal accusations remain untried than to decide between the rival claims. These quarrels were not merely occasional, but were continuous and perpetual. A letter of June 18th, 1667, happens to mention that there were then 4 or 5 competencias delayed by the question whether in the conferences the royal judge should bring his own notary. Perverted ingenuity was constantly devising new points over which strife could be created. Prisoners on trial in the royal jails were sometimes borrowed by the tribunal to be prosecuted for blasphemy or other trivial offence against the faith. In 1666 a case of this kind gave rise to a question as to the exact form of receipt to be given for the body of the culprit, when it was pushed to such a point that the Suprema ordered the excommunication of all the judges of the Audiencia, and the Council of Aragon complained to the Queen Regent about the oppressive abuse of censures, and asked her to provide that for the future the mutual obligations of the two tribunals should be equal and reciprocal. When the Inquisition took such pains to make itself detested, one is scarce surprised to learn, from a complaint of the Suprema in 1677, that in Barcelona it had so fallen in public esteem that it was able to procure but one familiar, and that the alguazil mayor had asked to be relieved from carrying his wand of office, for no noble was willing to be seen walking with him when he bore it. This hostility it continued carefully to cultivate. In December 1695 the Diputados and judges arrested Carlos II, a complaint of the multiplied excesses of the tribunal, which trampled on the laws and liberties of the land, causing such scandals that they could no longer be endured in silence. This had been especially the case since Bartolome Antonio Sanz Imunas had been inquisitor, whose methods can be appreciated by a single example. Captain General Marquis of Gastanara, had imprisoned a Frenchman named Jaime Bal on a matter of state, Spain being at the time at war with France, with strict orders to keep him incommunicado. Munoz suddenly demanded an opportunity of taking testimony of him. Gastanara was absent, and no one had authority to violate his instructions, but the regent of the royal chancery and the jailer offered, if Munoz would declare it to be a matter of faith, to endeavour to find some means of compliance. This assurance he refused to give, even verbally, and he threatened the regent with excommunication. The Audiencia invited him to a conference, which he refused, and it then cited him before the Banch Royal, with a customary warning of banishment and seizure of temporalities. Munoz responded December 29th, with a mandate to the regent ordering him, under pain of excommunication, to allow the deposition of the prisoner to be taken, and he followed this within an hour, with an excommunication published in all the pulpits and affixed to all the church doors. The next day this was re-aggravated, and the regent was publicly cursed with the awful anathema formulated for hardened and impenitent sinners. The Audiencia rejoined with the decree of banishment and seizure of temporalities, under the customary term of 15 days. The tribunal answered this with a threat of interdict on the city. It convoked all the superiors of the religious orders, and arranged with the clergy for a great procession, when it should take its departure. It kept its doors closed, and even refused to receive the messengers of Gastanara, who had hastened back to Barcelona, but he delayed further action until he should communicate with Madrid and receive the royal orders. When they came, on January 11th, 1696, he was at Montalegre, a couple of leagues from the city. They were sent to him by a special courier, and he returned the next morning, and made secret arrangements for their execution. At 2 p.m. he sent word to Munoz that he wished to see him on the king's service. At 4:30 p.m. Munoz came, bringing the fiscal with him. A scrivener was introduced, who read to him the king's order, which he said he was ready to obey. Gastanara told him that he must start at once. A coach was at the door, to which he was escorted with all honour. Lackeys with flambeaux were ready, and a guard of 25 musketeers. Gastanara gave him money, and he was provided with all comforts, even to a courteous gentleman as a companion, to enforce all proper respect for him. As he was leaving the palace, his violent temper burst forth in regrets that he had not been allowed time to cast the interdict on the city. He was driven to the embarcadero, placed on board a vessel that had been made ready, and was conveyed to the nearest Valencian port. It is symptomatic of Spanish conditions that in wartime the Captain General was obliged to abandon all other duties and devote a day to kidnapping a troublesome priest, and this is emphasized by the fact that the Inquisitor-General rewarded the conduct of Munoz by appointing him to one of the most desirable tribunals of Spain. Possibly this affair may have influenced Carlos II in reissuing, in 1696, his father's injunction of 1661 to observe the Concordias exactly and to be more sparing of excommunications. Philip V was scarce seated on the throne when he found himself confronted with the eternal question of Catalan hostility towards the tribunal. A consulta of the Suprema, October 16, 1701, warns him that the Inquisitors of Barcelona report that, in the Cortes about to assemble, efforts will be made to limit its usefulness, and he is exhorted to follow the example of his predecessors. Whatever was done was of little consequence for, in the war which broke out soon afterwards, Catalonia enthusiastically acknowledged the Archduke Charles as Carlos III, and became the stronghold of the Austrian party. The situation of the rebellion of 1640 to 1652 was duplicated. The tribunal was withdrawn, but seemed to have been replaced by a local organization, for an article of the Cortes of 1706, duly approved by the Austrian Carlos, regulating the insaculación for public office, recognizes its certificates respecting its officials. Of course it could exercise no jurisdiction over the heretic English allies. It has left no traces of its activity, and was replaced by a revival of the episcopal cognizance of heresy. As to places beyond the control of the Austrian party, a provision of the Suprema, March 16, 1706, extended the jurisdiction of the Saragossa tribunal over all that should be recovered from the enemy until such time as the Inquisition of Barcelona should be re-established. The desperate resistance of the Catalans postponed this until 1715, and when the tribunals reinstated, it found in the secret prison two captives, Juan d'Astillo, a bigamist, and Mariana Costa, accused of sorcery, both of them confined by order of the Vicar General of the diocese. As all the liberties and privileges of Catalonia were abolished by the conquerors, its subsequent relations with the Inquisition offer no special characteristics. End of Book 2, Chapter 4, Part 6. Recording by David Cole, Medway, Massachusetts.